Welcome to Sleepless History, where we explore historical events in a calm, measured way designed to help you drift off into peaceful slumber. I'm your host, and tonight we embark on a comprehensive journey through one of the most transformative periods in Middle Eastern history, Iran, from 1979 to 2025. Over the next few hours, we'll explore how a nation transformed from a modernizing monarchy into an Islamic Republic, examining the revolution that changed everything, the society that emerged, and the lives of ordinary Iranians across nearly 5 decades. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin our exploration of this fascinating chapter of human history. Chapter 1. The World Before the Revolution. To understand the revolution of 1979, we must first understand what came before it. Iran in the 1960s and 70s was a nation in transition, caught between tradition and modernity, between East and West, between its ancient Persian heritage and an uncertain future. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi had ruled Iran since 1941, when Allied forces removed his father, Reza Shah, from power during World War II. The younger Shah, educated in Switzerland, had grand ambitions for Iran. He envisioned transforming his country into a modern, industrialized nation that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the great powers of the world. The Shah's vision was embodied in what he called the White Revolution, launched in 1963. This was an ambitious program of modernization that touched nearly every aspect of Iranian society. The name itself, the White Revolution, was chosen deliberately to contrast with communist Red Revolution, positioning the Shah's reforms as a peaceful, top-down alternative to violent upheaval. Land reform was the centerpiece of the White Revolution. For centuries, Iranian agriculture had been dominated by large landholders who controlled vast estates, while peasant farmers worked the land as sharecroppers or tenant farmers. The land reform program sought to break this feudal system by redistributing property from large landholders to the peasants who worked it. Between 1962 and 1971, approximately 2 million families received land. The land reform had mixed results. Some peasants benefited from ownership of land they had previously worked for others, but many received plots too small to be economically viable. The agricultural cooperatives meant to support small farmers were often poorly managed and corrupt. Traditional village structures were disrupted without being replaced by effective alternatives. Food production, which had been expected to increase, actually stagnated or declined in some areas. Women gained the right to vote and hold political office in 1963, a revolutionary change for Iran and the broader Middle East region. Women could now participate in elections as voters and candidates. While few women initially ran for office, their legal right to do so marked a significant shift. By the 1970s, several women served in parliament, and women held positions in the cabinet and judiciary. Women judges, though few in number, presided over cases, something unthinkable a generation earlier. Literacy programs spread throughout the countryside through the Literacy Corps, modelled on the American Peace Corps. Young men, often university students fulfilling their military service, were sent to rural villages to teach basic literacy and numeracy. The program had significant impact, particularly in remote areas that had never had schools. Literacy rates, particularly among women and rural residents, increased substantially during this period. The Shah built universities, hospitals, and factories at a rapid pace. Tehran University expanded dramatically, and new universities opened in provincial cities. The education system grew to accommodate a population hungry for learning and advancement. Medical schools trained doctors, engineering programs produced engineers, and technical institutes prepared skilled workers. This expansion created opportunities for social mobility that had not existed before. He invested heavily in infrastructure, from highways to hydroelectric dams. The Trans-Iranian Railway, begun under his father, was extended and modernized. New roads connected previously isolated regions. Dams provided electricity and irrigation water. Ports were expanded to handle increased trade. The physical transformation of the country was visible and dramatic. Tehran, the capital, was transforming into a cosmopolitan city that reflected the Shah's modernizing ambitions. The city's population exploded from around 1 million in the 1940s to over 4 million by the mid-1970s. Modern buildings of glass and steel rose alongside traditional bazaars, creating a skyline that mixed old and new, east and west. The northern parts of Tehran, particularly neighborhoods like Shemiran and Tadrish, became enclaves of wealth and westernization. Here, modern apartment buildings and villas housed the growing upper and middle classes. Shopping centers offered imported goods from Europe and America. Restaurants served French, Italian, and Chinese cuisine, alongside traditional Persian dishes. The streets were clean and tree-lined, with European cars parked along them. Nightclubs, cinemas, and restaurants thrived throughout the city. Tehran's nightlife was vibrant and diverse. Nightclubs featured live music, from traditional Persian music to Western rock and jazz. Discotheques attracted young people who danced to the latest hits from Europe and America. Cabarets offered entertainment that would have scandalized traditional Iranians, but attracted sophisticated urbanites seeking modern pleasures. Cinemas were ubiquitous in Tehran and other major cities. They showed both Iranian films and foreign movies, particularly from Hollywood and Europe. Young couples went to movies as a dating activity, sitting together in darkened theatres in a way that would have been improper in traditional settings. The cinema became a space where social mixing and modern courtship could occur away from the eyes of conservative family members. Cafes and restaurants became gathering places for intellectuals, artists, and students. These establishments served as informal salons where people debated politics, discussed literature and philosophy, and planned artistic projects. The cafe culture, borrowed from Europe, took root in Iranian urban life, creating public spaces for intellectual exchange and social interaction. Western fashions appeared on city streets, particularly in affluent neighborhoods. Young women wore miniskirts, tight jeans, and sleeveless tops. They styled their hair in the latest European fashions and wore makeup freely. Men wore Western suits, casual slacks, and button-down shirts. Traditional clothing, like the chador for women and the long robe for men, was still common in working-class neighborhoods and among older, more traditional people, but it was increasingly rare among the young and educated. The University of Tehran became a center of intellectual discourse where students debated philosophy, politics, and Iran's future. The campus buzzed with political activity, with various student groups representing different ideological positions. Leftist students organized reading groups and discussion circles. Liberal students called for democracy and civil rights. Islamic students, though a minority in the 1960s and early 70s, maintained their presence and argued for the relevance of Islamic values in modern life. The university's atmosphere was relatively free and open, at least compared to what would come after the revolution. Professors taught Western philosophy, social sciences, and literature alongside traditional subjects. Students read Marx, Sartre, and Camus. They debated existentialism, socialism, and nationalism. The intellectual ferment was genuine and exciting, though it occurred within limits set by SAVAK, which monitored political activity and suppressed anything deemed threatening to the regime. The middle class expanded rapidly during this period, as oil revenues poured into the economy and created new opportunities in business, government, and the professions. Government bureaucracy grew, creating jobs for educated workers. Private businesses expanded, needing managers, accountants, and professionals. The oil industry and related sectors employed thousands of engineers, technicians, and support staff. Banks, insurance companies, and other service industries mushroomed, offering employment to a growing white-collar workforce. This expanding middle class became the social base for the Shah's modernization project. These were people who benefited from the new economic opportunities, who sent their children to university, who travelled abroad, who consumed imported goods, and who identified with Western modernity. They lived in the new apartment buildings in North Tehran, drove European cars, and aspired to Western lifestyles. They were the winners in the Shah's Iran. For women, particularly in urban areas, the pre-revolutionary period represented unprecedented freedom and opportunity. The Family Protection Law of 1967 and its revision in 1975 gave women rights in divorce and child custody that were revolutionary for the region. Under traditional Islamic law as interpreted and practiced in Iran, men could divorce women easily by simply declaring talaq 3 times, while women had extremely limited grounds for divorce. Men automatically received custody of children after a certain age. Polygamy was unrestricted. The Family Protection Law changed this dramatically. Women could obtain divorces more easily, with grounds including abuse, addiction, mental illness, and abandonment. They had greater say in custody matters, with courts required to consider the children's best interests rather than automatically awarding custody to fathers. Polygamy was restricted, requiring the first wife's consent and court approval, with courts instructed to deny permission unless there were compelling circumstances. The minimum marriage age for women was raised to 18 and for men to 20, reducing child marriage. These legal changes had real impacts on women's lives. Women who were trapped in abusive or unhappy marriages had legal recourse they had not possessed before. Women could fight for custody of their children rather than automatically losing them to fathers or paternal relatives. Young girls could not be married off as children, giving them more time for education and personal development. Family courts were established to handle family law matters with procedures designed to protect women's rights. Women judges and lawyers worked in these courts, a visible symbol of women's new role in the legal system. Women could represent themselves or hire female lawyers, creating a space where women's voices could be heard and taken seriously. Women entered universities in growing numbers. a transformation that would have profound long-term effects even after the revolution. By the mid-1970s, women made up about 30% of university students studying medicine, engineering, law, and the sciences. In some fields, like education and nursing, women made up the majority of students. In others, like engineering and hard sciences, they were a minority but a visible and growing one. Women studied alongside men in most universities and programs. Classrooms were mixed, with male and female students sitting together, studying together, and participating equally in class discussions. This co-education was normal in the pre-revolutionary period, taken for granted by students who had no idea it would later be eliminated. Female students formed friendships and study groups with male colleagues, dated, and sometimes married men they met at university. The experience of university education was transformative for women. It gave them professional credentials and skills. It exposed them to new ideas and ways of thinking. It connected them with other educated women, creating networks that would last a lifetime. It gave them confidence and a sense of possibility about what they could achieve. Many of these women would become doctors, engineers, lawyers, and professors, establishing careers that they would struggle to maintain after the revolution. They worked as teachers, doctors, engineers, civil servants, and business owners. Women teachers were common, staffing girls' schools and increasingly working in mixed or boys' schools as well. Women doctors specialized in fields like obstetrics, gynecology, and pediatrics, but also in general medicine, surgery, and other specialties. Women engineers worked in industries from construction to telecommunications to oil and gas. Women civil servants staffed government ministries, working as administrators, policy specialists, and managers. Women business owners ran everything from small shops to large enterprises. Some inherited businesses from fathers or husbands and proved capable managers. Others started their own ventures, often in sectors like fashion, beauty, and hospitality, but also in manufacturing, import-export, and services. These entrepreneurial women demonstrated that women could succeed in the competitive business world. Women served in the military and police forces in small but symbolic numbers. Women officers commanded female units and worked in administrative and support roles. Women police officers worked particularly with female suspects and victims, conducting searches and interrogations that would be improper for male officers. The presence of women in uniform, carrying authority and weapons, symbolized how much had changed. They drove cars, a freedom that seems basic, but was not universal in the region even then. Women drove themselves to work, to university, to shop, and to socialize. They were not dependent on male relatives for transportation. This mobility gave women independence and freedom of movement that would be difficult to imagine without it. Women traveled alone, both within Iran and internationally. A woman could travel to another city for work or education without a male chaperone. She could travel abroad for study, business, or pleasure. She did not need her father's or husband's permission, at least not legally, though family pressure remained significant for many women. This freedom of movement was another aspect of women's autonomy that would later be restricted. Women wore miniskirts or traditional clothing as they chose, and participated actively in public life. The choice of clothing was personal and varied by individual preference, social class, and family background. In affluent North Tehran, miniskirts, hot pants, and sleeveless dresses were common. In traditional South Tehran neighborhoods, many women wore chador or conservative clothing. Most women fell somewhere in between, wearing modest Western clothing like knee-length skirts or pants with blouses. The key was choice. Women decided how to dress based on their own preferences and circumstances, not government mandate. A woman could wear a chador if she chose, or a miniskirt if she preferred, or anything in between. The government did not dictate women's clothing or punish women for their choices. This freedom of choice, more than any particular style of dress, was what mattered. Iranian cinema flourished during this period, producing films that explored social issues and human relationships with increasing sophistication. The Iranian New Wave, as it came to be known, emerged in the late 1960s and 1970s, creating films that combined artistic ambition with social commentary. Directors like Dariush Merjou, Masoud Kimiai, and Sohrab Shahid Sayles created works that examined the tensions within Iranian society, the impact of rapid modernization, and the lives of ordinary people struggling with change. Merjoui's The Cow, released in 1969, told the story of a villager whose beloved cow dies, driving him to madness and delusion. The film was a metaphor for Iran's traditional society under stress, and it marked a turning point in Iranian cinema toward more serious, artistic filmmaking. Kimiai's Khazar, also from 1969, was a revenge drama set in the traditional bazaar districts of Tehran. The film's anti-hero, Khazar, seeks vengeance for his sister's dishonor, embodying traditional codes of honor in conflict with modern legal and moral frameworks. The film was hugely popular and spawned a genre of films dealing with honor, revenge, and the clash between traditional and modern values. Films explored themes of poverty, class conflict, rural-urban migration, women's struggles, and the psychological costs of rapid social change. They showed prostitutes, drug addicts, slum dwellers, and other marginalized people whose lives were rarely depicted in Iranian media. They questioned the Shah's narrative of progress and prosperity by showing the dark underside of modernization. The film industry operated under censorship, of course. Savak reviewed scripts and finished films, banning content deemed politically subversive or morally offensive. Films could not directly criticize the Shah or the monarchy. They had to be careful about religious themes. Sexual content was restricted, though less strictly than it would be after the revolution. But within these constraints, filmmakers found ways to tell meaningful stories and explore important themes. International film festivals began recognizing Iranian cinema, with films winning prizes and critical acclaim. This international attention gave Iranian filmmakers prestige and some protection, as the regime was proud of Iran's cultural achievements and wanted to present a sophisticated image to the world. The global success of Iranian cinema suggested that Iran could be both modern and authentically Iranian, both Western and Eastern, both progressive and true to its cultural roots. Music, too, reflected the era's complexity and vibrancy. Traditional Persian classical music coexisted with popular music influenced by Western rock and jazz, creating a diverse musical landscape. Classical musicians like Mohammad Reza Shajarian and Parisa carried forward centuries-old traditions of Persian music, performing in concerts and on radio and television. Their performances connected contemporary Iranians to their cultural heritage and maintained living links to the past. Popular music was where the most dramatic changes occurred. Singers and bands created music that blended Persian melodies and poetry with Western instrumentation and styles. Electric guitars, drums, and synthesizers joined traditional instruments like the tar, sitar, and santur. The results were unique to Iran, neither purely Western nor purely traditional, but something new and distinctly Iranian. Singers like Gugush became superstars, performing to packed concert halls in Tehran and other cities. Gugush, in particular, became an icon of the pre-revolutionary period. A singer and actress, she embodied the modern Iranian woman, talented, independent, fashionable, and free. Her concerts drew thousands of fans, particularly young people and women. She sang love songs, pop songs, and ballads that spoke to the experiences and emotions of ordinary Iranians navigating modern life. Male singers like Dariush, Ebi, and Farhad also achieved great popularity, each with distinctive styles and loyal followings. Some focused on romantic ballads, others on social commentary, still others on modernized versions of traditional folk music. Radio played their songs constantly, and their cassette tapes sold in huge numbers. The music scene included venues ranging from intimate cafes to large concert halls. In cafes and small clubs, musicians performed for small audiences in intimate settings, creating spaces for musical experimentation and appreciation. Large concert halls hosted major stars performing for thousands. The Rudaki Hall in Tehran, the premier concert venue, featured both classical Persian music and modern popular concerts, serving as a temple of Iranian musical culture. Nightclubs and cabarets offered entertainment that mixed music, dance, and variety acts. These venues catered to an adult audience seeking sophisticated nightlife. They featured singers, dancers, comedians, and musicians, performing in intimate settings with food and drink. The atmosphere was cosmopolitan and modern, reminiscent of nightlife in Paris, Beirut, or Istanbul. The art scene was vibrant and diverse, with galleries, theatres, and cultural centres throughout Tehran and other major cities. Art galleries exhibited works by Iranian painters and sculptors working in styles from traditional Persian miniature to abstract expressionism. Contemporary Iranian art engaged with international art movements while maintaining distinctive Iranian characteristics. Theatres performed both traditional Persian plays and Western drama, from Shakespeare to contemporary European and American playwrights. The theatre scene was intellectually engaged and politically conscious, with many plays exploring social issues and critiquing aspects of Iranian society. Directors and playwrights pushed boundaries, testing the limits of what could be said on stage. Cultural centres hosted lectures, readings, film screenings, and discussions. These spaces served as hubs for intellectual and artistic life, bringing together writers, artists, scholars, and interested citizens. The Goethe Institute, the British Council, and similar cultural organisations sponsored events that connected Iranians with global cultural currents, while providing spaces for local cultural production. Poetry readings drew large audiences, reflecting Iranians' deep love for poetry. Contemporary poets like Farah Farrokhzad, Ahmad Shamlu, and Sohrab Sepehri wrote poetry that spoke to modern experiences while drawing on Iran's rich poetic tradition. Farrokhzad, in particular, wrote powerful feminist poetry that explored women's inner lives and challenged traditional gender roles. Her death in a car accident in 1967 made her a legend, and her poetry remained widely read and loved. Yet beneath this surface of modernity and progress, profound tensions were building. The Shah's modernization program had created winners and losers. Traditional merchants in the bazaars saw their economic influence diminished by new businesses with connections to the royal court. Religious scholars, known as the ulama, watched with growing concern as their influence over education and family law eroded. Rural migrants flooding into cities seeking work often found themselves in crowded slums, disconnected from their traditional communities but unable to access the benefits of the new economy. The Shah's political system allowed little space for dissent or participation. Savak, the secret police, was notorious for its brutal suppression of opposition. Political parties existed only at the Shah's pleasure. Elections were staged affairs with predetermined outcomes. The press was heavily censored. Those who spoke out against the regime faced imprisonment, torture, or exile. Corruption was endemic. The Shah's family and a narrow circle of elites controlled vast wealth and economic opportunities. Stories of extravagant spending by the royal court and connected families contrasted sharply with the poverty many Iranians experienced. The gap between rich and poor widened despite overall economic growth. The economy itself was dangerously unbalanced. Oil revenues funded the government's ambitious spending, but when oil prices fluctuated, the entire economy lurched. Inflation became a serious problem in the mid-1970s, eroding the living standards of workers and the middle class. By 1977, inflation was running at over 25% annually. Housing costs in Tehran had skyrocketed. The boom was creating inflation and inequality faster than it was creating shared prosperity. Iran's close relationship with the United States was another source of tension. The Shah's government received massive military and economic support from Washington, which saw Iran as a crucial ally in the Cold War and a stabilizing force in the Persian Gulf region. American military advisors, business people, and contractors flooded into Iran. By the mid-1970s, tens of thousands of Americans lived in Iran, many in comfortable compounds that seemed worlds apart from Iranian society. To many Iranians, the American presence symbolized the Shah's dependence on foreign powers and his disregard for Iranian sovereignty. Historical memories ran deep. In 1953, the CIA and British intelligence had orchestrated a coup that overthrew Prime Minister Mohammad, who had nationalized Iran's oil industry and consolidated the Shah's power. Though a quarter century had passed, this intervention remained a raw wound in Iranian political consciousness. Religious opposition to the Shah had existed for years, but it intensified in the 1970s. The most prominent voice of religious opposition belonged to Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a senior Shiite cleric who had been exiled in 1964 after speaking out against the Shah's policies. From exile in Iraq and later in France, Khomeini's recorded sermons circulated widely in Iran, carried by cassette tapes that passed from hand to hand. Khomeini's message was uncompromising. He rejected the Shah's entire modernization project as a betrayal of Islamic values and Iranian identity. He condemned the regime's corruption, its repression, and its subservience to the United States. He argued that the Shah's government was fundamentally illegitimate and that true Islamic governance should replace it. His vision of Islamic government, outlined in a series of lectures in 1970, proposed that religious scholars should guide society and that Islamic law should form the foundation of the legal system. But religious opposition was only one current in the broader stream of dissent. Leftist groups, influenced by Marxism and anti-colonial movements, saw the Shah as a puppet of American imperialism and capitalism. Liberal intellectuals wanted democracy, civil liberties, and the rule of law. Nationalist groups resented foreign influence and wanted Iran to chart its own course. Bazaar merchants wanted economic policies that protected their interests. These diverse groups had little in common except their opposition to the Shah. They disagreed profoundly about what should replace his regime. Yet in the revolutionary moment that was approaching, these differences would be set aside in the urgent task of bringing down the existing order. Only later would these groups discover that their visions for Iran's future were incompatible. One more element must be mentioned to understand the pre-revolutionary situation, the intellectual ferment of the 1970s. Iranian universities and literary circles buzzed with debates about identity, authenticity, modernity, and Iran's place in the world. Thinkers like Jalal al-Ahmad wrote about Westoxication, the idea that Iran was being poisoned by blind imitation of Western culture. Ali Shariati, a sociologist and Islamic thinker, reinterpreted Shiite Islam in revolutionary terms, arguing that Islam called for social justice and resistance to oppression. These intellectuals created a vocabulary and framework that would help fuel the revolution. They gave voice to a widespread feeling that Iran had lost its way, that modernization had come at too high a price, that authenticity and justice had been sacrificed for material progress and foreign approval. Their ideas reached far beyond academic circles, influencing students, professionals, and even religious scholars. By 1977, Iran seems to outside observers to be stable and prosperous. The Shah celebrated the nation's progress. Foreign investors poured money into Iranian projects. The military was well equipped with advanced American weapons. The secret police appeared to have dissent well under control. Yet beneath this facade, the foundations of the Shah's regime were crumbling. Economic problems were mounting. Social tensions were intensifying. The various opposition groups, though divided in their goals, were growing bolder, and millions of Iranians from different classes and with different grievances were losing faith in the existing system. It would take only a spark to ignite this volatile mixture. Chapter 2. The Revolutionary Year, 1978 to 1979. The spark came in January 1978, though few recognized it as such at the time. A newspaper article published on January 7th attacked Ayatollah Khomeini in harsh personal terms, calling him a foreign agent working against Iran's interests. The article, widely believed to have been written at the Shah's direction, was intended to discredit the exiled cleric. Instead, it provoked outrage. In the religious city of Qom, theological students and their supporters took to the streets in protest. On January 9th, demonstrations in Qom turned violent. Security forces opened fire, killing several protesters. The exact number of deaths remains disputed, with accounts ranging from 2 to 70, but what mattered was that protesters had died. This event set in motion a pattern that would drive the revolution forward with inexorable momentum. In Shiite tradition, memorial services are held for the dead on the 40th day after death. These gatherings, known as Arba'in, are important religious and social occasions. 40 days after the Qom killings, memorial services were held throughout Iran. Many of these gatherings turned into protest demonstrations. Again, violence erupted. Again, protesters were killed. 40 days later, more memorial services, more protests, more deaths. This 40-day cycle created a regular rhythm of protest that built upon itself. Each round of demonstrations was larger than the last. Each brought more deaths, which meant more martyrs to commemorate 40 days later. The government seemed unable to break this cycle. Repression only created more martyrs, fueling more outrage and larger demonstrations. Throughout the spring and summer of 1978, the protests grew. They spread from religious cities to secular Tehran. They drew in students, workers, bazaar merchants, and middle-class professionals. The opposition remained fractious, united only in demanding the Shah's removal. Khomeini's statements from exile in Iraq captured the moment's spirit, offering uncompromising rejection of the regime. The Shah vacillated between repression and concession, satisfying no one. He removed Savak's chief. He promised political reforms. He lifted some press restrictions. But these half measures came too late and seemed insincere. The opposition smelled weakness and pressed harder. In August 1978, a tragic event galvanized the revolution. On August 19th, a fire at the Cinema Rex in the city of Abadan killed more than 400 people. The locked doors prevented escape. Opposition groups immediately blamed Savak for setting the fire to discredit the opposition. The government insisted that Islamic militants opposed to cinema had set the blaze. Modern research suggests it was likely set by Islamic extremists, but at the time, most Iranians blamed the government. The Cinema Rex fire became a symbol of the regime's brutality. September 8th, 1978, marked another turning point. Massive protests in Tehran on September 7th prompted the Shah to declare martial law. But news of the martial law declaration spread slowly. On the morning of September 8th, thousands of demonstrators gathered in Jala Square, many unaware that assembly was now illegal. Security forces confronted the crowd. What happened next remains disputed, but the outcome was clear. Soldiers opened fire on unarmed civilians. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, died. Black Friday, as September 8th became known, shattered any remaining hope for compromise. The opposition now saw the Shah as a murderer, willing to massacre his own people. The middle classes, who had been cautiously watching from the sidelines, began joining the demonstrations. The Shah's support base was eroding rapidly. October and November brought a wave of strikes that paralyzed the economy. Oil workers walked off their jobs, cutting production and starving the government of revenue. Civil servants stopped working. Banks closed. Even employees of the television and radio networks struck, sometimes broadcasting revolutionary messages before shutting down transmitters. The bazaars shut down in a general strike. This was particularly significant because bazaar merchants were traditionally conservative and cautious. Their participation in the general strike signaled that even Iran's traditional commercial class had turned against the Shah. The bazaris brought not just their bodies to the revolution, but their money, funding opposition activities and supporting striking workers. Demonstrations now occurred almost daily, drawing millions into the streets. The crowds chanted, "Death to the Shah," and "Khomeini is our leader." Women participated actively, wearing the chador as a symbol of opposition to the Shah's modernization and as a way to show solidarity with traditional values, though many would later regret what this symbolism enabled. The Shah's army faced an impossible situation. Conscript soldiers, drawn from ordinary Iranian families, were increasingly reluctant to fire on demonstrators who might include their own relatives. Morale crumbled. Desertions increased. Some units refused orders. The Shah could no longer count on the military's loyalty. In early November, the Shah appointed a military government in a last attempt to restore order. General Gholam Reza Azhari became prime minister, but even a military government could not suppress the revolution. The strikes continued. The demonstrations grew larger. Revolutionary fervour was reaching a crescendo. December brought the month of Muharram, the most important month in the Shiite religious calendar, commemorating the martyrdom of Imam Hussein at Karbala in the year 680. For centuries, Shiites had marked this month with processions, mourning rituals, and religious gatherings. In December 1978, these traditional observances became revolutionary demonstrations. On December 10th and 11th, during the holy days of Tasu'a and Ashura, millions of Iranians poured into the streets in cities throughout the country. These were likely the largest demonstrations in human history up to that point. In Tehran alone, estimates suggest 2 to 4 million people marched. They demanded the Shah's removal and Khomeini's return. The government did not even attempt to stop them. The revolution had become unstoppable. The Shah now grasped that his reign was over. He tried desperately to arrange a transition that would preserve some role for the monarchy. He appointed Shapur Bakhtiar, an opposition politician and member of the National Front, as prime minister. Bakhtiar had impeccable opposition credentials, having been imprisoned by the Shah's regime. But Bakhtiar's willingness to work within the monarchical framework isolated him from the revolutionary movement. The opposition denounced him as a traitor. On January 16, 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi left Iran, ostensibly for a vacation, but in reality fleeing the revolution. Crowds filled the streets celebrating. The monarchy that had ruled Iran for 2,500 years had effectively ended, though it would take several more weeks for this reality to become official. The Shah's departure left a power vacuum. Prime Minister Bakhtiar headed a caretaker government with limited authority and less legitimacy. The real power lay with the revolutionary movement, and increasingly that meant Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini had moved from Iraq to France in October 1978, taking up residence in the Paris suburb of Neauphle-le-Château. From there, he gave interviews to international media, issued statements to his followers in Iran, and positioned himself as the revolution's leader. His message was skillfully calibrated to maintain the broadest possible coalition. He spoke of democracy, freedom, and justice in terms that liberals and leftists could embrace, while reassuring religious conservatives that Islamic values would be protected. On February 1st, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran after 15 years of exile. Millions lined the streets from the airport to Tehran's Behesht-e Cemetery, where he gave his first speech on Iranian soil. The crowd was so large that the journey, normally less than an hour, took nearly 6 hours. Khomeini's return speech set the tone for what would follow. He thanked the Iranian people for their sacrifices. He declared the Bakhtiar government illegal and promised to appoint a provisional government based on Islamic and democratic principles. He struck a note of revolutionary determination. "I will kick their teeth in," he said, of those who opposed the Islamic movement. The next days saw a complex political struggle as the Bakhtiar government tried to maintain order while Khomeini's Revolutionary Council worked to establish a parallel authority. The military leadership tried desperately to stay neutral to avoid civil war while the political situation sorted itself out. On February 9th, fighting erupted between pro-Khomeini guerrilla groups and the Shah's Imperial Guard at Doshan Tepe Air Base in Tehran. What began as a small clash spiraled into broader fighting across the capital. Revolutionary committees armed civilians. Military units split, with some joining the revolution and others defending the government. For 2 days, Tehran echoed with gunfire as a low-intensity civil war raged. On February 11th, the military announced its neutrality and withdrew to its barracks. Without military support, the Bakhtiar government collapsed. Revolutionary forces seized control of government buildings, television and radio stations, and the main symbols of state power. By evening, the revolution had triumphed. February 11th, 1979 became the official victory date of the Islamic Revolution. The 2,500-year-old Iranian monarchy had fallen. The Pahlavi dynasty that had ruled since 1925 was finished. A new era in Iranian history had begun, though what exactly this era would bring remained to be determined. Chapter 3: The Consolidation of Theocratic Rule. In the immediate aftermath of the revolution's victory, Iran experienced a moment of possibility. Multiple visions for the country's future competed for dominance. The revolutionary coalition that had overthrown the Shah was diverse and fragmented, united only by opposition to the old regime. Now that the Shah was gone, the coalition's deep divisions came to the fore. Ayatollah Khomeini moved quickly to consolidate clerical control, but this was not a foregone conclusion. Liberal nationalists, led by figures like Mehdi Bazargan, whom Khomeini appointed as provisional prime minister, wanted a democratic Islamic state with guaranteed civil liberties. Leftist groups, including the Marxist Fedayeen and the Islamic Socialist Mujahideen, envisioned a revolutionary government that would redistribute wealth and confront imperialism. Ethnic minorities, particularly Kurds and Azerbaijanis, sought autonomy or independence. Even within the religious establishment, there was disagreement about how involved clerics should be in governing. Khomeini's vision of velayat-e-faqih, or guardianship of the jurist, held that senior Islamic scholars should have ultimate political authority. This was a controversial position even among Shiite clerics. Many senior ayatollahs disagreed, arguing that clerics should guide society morally but not rule directly. But Khomeini had several advantages. He enjoyed enormous popular prestige as the revolution's symbolic leader. He was supported by committed networks of clerics, theological students, and religious organizations, and he was willing to use force to eliminate opponents. In March 1979, a referendum asked Iranians whether they wanted an Islamic Republic. No other options appeared on the ballot. The vote was nearly unanimous in favour, though critics noted that the question's phrasing gave voters no real choice and that secular and leftist groups had called for a boycott. Regardless, the referendum gave the new regime a veneer of democratic legitimacy. A constitutional assembly was elected to draft a new constitution. Initially, liberal and nationalist delegates held significant influence, but Khomeini intervened to ensure the assembly was dominated by clerics and their supporters. The resulting constitution, approved in December 1979, enshrined Velayat-e-Faqih as the foundation of the political system. The constitution created a complex hybrid system. It included democratic elements like an elected president and parliament, but ultimate authority rested with the supreme leader, a position filled by a senior cleric who would serve for life. The supreme leader controlled the military, the judiciary, and the media. He could dismiss the president and veto legislation. An appointed guardian council would screen candidates for office and review laws for Islamic compliance. Democracy existed, but was circumscribed by clerical oversight at every level. Khomeini became the first supreme leader, a position he would hold until his death in 1989. His authority was immense, though he often operated behind the scenes, allowing others to take public responsibility for controversial decisions while he shaped policy from above. The process of consolidating clerical rule involved systematically eliminating or sidelining other revolutionary factions. This happened in stages throughout 1979 and 1980, accelerating after the seizure of the American embassy in November 1979. The embassy takeover proved to be a crucial turning point. On November 4th, 1979, student militants calling themselves Students Following the Line of the Imam seized the United States Embassy in Tehran and took 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage. They demanded the extradition of the Shah, who was in the United States receiving medical treatment for cancer, and wanted the U.S. to apologize for its historical interference in Iran. The embassy seizure was initially a student action, not ordered by Khomeini. But when Khomeini saw the public enthusiasm for the takeover, he endorsed it. The hostage crisis became a defining event of the new regime, radicalizing the revolution and isolating Iran internationally. Domestically, the crisis was used to crush the moderate provisional government. Prime Minister Bazargan resigned in protest over the embassy seizure, and the Clerical Revolutionary Council took direct control. The crisis unleashed a wave of revolutionary fervour that the regime channeled against its opponents. Anyone who criticized the embassy takeover could be accused of siding with America. Moderates and liberals were systematically pushed out of positions of influence. The hostage crisis lasted 444 days, ending only in January 1981, with the release of the hostages moments after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as US President. The crisis accomplished several things for the clerical regime. It galvanized nationalist sentiment against the United States. It gave the regime an external enemy to rally the population. It allowed hardliners to paint moderates as insufficiently committed to the revolution, and it isolated Iran internationally, making the population more dependent on the regime. But the costs were also substantial. The crisis led to American sanctions, frozen Iranian assets, and Iran's international isolation. It contributed to the outbreak of war with Iraq in September 1980, as Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein calculated that revolutionary chaos and international isolation made Iran vulnerable. The 8-year war that followed would profoundly shape the Islamic Republic. Throughout this period, the regime was also dealing with internal armed opposition. Leftist guerrilla groups that had fought against the Shah now turned their weapons on the Islamic Republic. The Mujahideen-e-Khalq, or MEK, a group that blended Islamic and Marxist ideology, began an armed campaign against the government in June 1981 after the regime moved to suppress them. The MEK assassinated prominent officials, including Ayatollah Mohammad Beheshti, who died along with 72 other officials when a bomb destroyed the headquarters of the Islamic Republican Party in June 1981. In August, a bomb killed newly elected President Muhammad Ali Rajai and Prime Minister Mohammad Javad Bahona. The violence was met with even greater state violence. Revolutionary courts sentenced thousands to execution, often after perfunctory trials. Prisons filled with political prisoners. The regime created a pervasive security apparatus to monitor and suppress dissent. The ethnic minorities also faced suppression. Kurdish guerrillas, who had fought against the Shah, now battled the Islamic Republic for autonomy. The regime responded with military force, sending Revolutionary Guards and army units to crush the Kurdish insurgency. Similar conflicts erupted with Turkmen, Baluchi, and other minority groups. By 1983, the regime had largely consolidated its power. The liberals and moderates had been pushed aside. The leftist guerrilla groups had been crushed through mass executions and imprisonment. Ethnic insurgencies had been suppressed. The clerical establishment controlled all key institutions of state power. Dissent was dangerous and rare. This consolidation came at a terrible human cost. Thousands had been executed, many after show trials. Tens of thousands filled prisons. Hundreds of thousands had fled into exile, creating Iranian diaspora communities in Europe, North America, and elsewhere. The initial hope and possibility of the revolution had given way to a reality of repression and conformity. Chapter 4: The War with Iraq, 1980 to 1988. On September 22nd, 1980, Iraqi forces invaded Iran, launching attacks along a 600-mile front. Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein calculated that revolutionary chaos had weakened Iran militarily and that Arab populations in Iran's oil-rich Khuzestan province might welcome Iraqi liberation. He also hoped to reverse the 1975 Algiers Agreement, which had established the border along the Shatt al-Arab waterway. The invasion came as a shock to Iran, though border skirmishes had been escalating for months. Iraqi forces advanced rapidly in some areas, seizing the city of Khorramshahr in October after brutal street fighting and laying siege to Abadan. But Iraqi forces bogged down elsewhere, and the anticipated collapse of Iran's revolutionary government never materialized. Instead, the war galvanized Iranian nationalism and allowed the regime to consolidate its power in the name of defending the nation. Revolutionary Guards and army units that had been at odds found common cause against the external enemy. Millions of volunteers, motivated by religious devotion, patriotism, or both, joined the fight or supported the war effort on the home front. Ayatollah Khomeini framed the war in religious terms as a holy defense against aggression. Young men were encouraged to volunteer for the front as an act of religious devotion. The concept of martyrdom, central to Shiite Islam, was mobilized to motivate soldiers and legitimize sacrifice. Those who died fighting Iraq were martyrs whose deaths guaranteed them paradise. The first 2 years of the war saw Iraqi forces occupying Iranian territory, while Iran struggled to mobilize and organize its defense. Iran's regular military had been purged of many officers loyal to the Shah, weakening its effectiveness. The Revolutionary Guards, formed to protect the revolution internally, had limited military experience. But Iran had vast manpower advantages and eventually wore down Iraqi forces through sheer numbers and determination. In May 1982, Iran launched Operation Beit al-Muqaddas and recaptured Khorramshahr, breaking the Iraqi siege and reclaiming most occupied territory. This victory was a turning point. Iran now faced a choice: accept a ceasefire and focus on reconstruction, or continue the war to overthrow Saddam Hussein and spread the Islamic Revolution. Khomeini chose to continue the war. Iranian forces invaded Iraq in July 1982, aiming to capture the holy city of Basra and possibly march to Baghdad. But this offensive failed. Iraq's military, fighting to defend its own territory with shorter supply lines, proved difficult to dislodge. The war settled into a brutal stalemate that would last 6 more years. The middle years of the war, from 1982 to 1987, saw massive human wave attacks, trench warfare reminiscent of World War I, and the use of chemical weapons by Iraq. Iranian forces would mass thousands of troops, including poorly trained volunteers and even teenagers, and send them in waves against Iraqi defenses. Iraqi artillery and machine guns would mow them down in horrific numbers. When one wave fell, another would follow. These tactics reflected Iran's advantages and disadvantages. Iran had far more people than Iraq, but less sophisticated weaponry. After the revolution and US sanctions, Iran struggled to obtain spare parts for its American-made weapons. Iraq, meanwhile, received support from the Soviet Union, France, the United States, and Arab Gulf states, all of whom feared the spread of revolutionary Islam. Iraq used chemical weapons extensively, deploying mustard gas and nerve agents against Iranian troops. These weapons caused terrible suffering, killing thousands and leaving many more with permanent injuries. The international community's muted response to Iraq's chemical weapons use left a lasting legacy of bitterness in Iran. The war expanded beyond the land battlefield. Iraq attacked Iranian oil facilities and shipping in the Persian Gulf, trying to cripple Iran's economy. Iran responded by attacking ships carrying Iraqi oil or serving Iraq's Arab allies. This tanker war threatened international shipping and eventually drew in the United States Navy to protect Kuwaiti tankers. Iranian cities, particularly Tehran and other population centers, came under Iraqi missile and air attack. Iraq fired Scud missiles at cities, causing civilian casualties and forcing people into shelters. The War of the Cities, as these exchanges became known, terrified civilians and demoralized the population, but did not break Iran's will to fight. Life on the home front during the war years was difficult. Rationing was imposed on basic goods. The economy, already disrupted by revolution, struggled under the burden of war. Young men were conscripted or volunteered for the front, leaving families without breadwinners and creating a gender imbalance in cities. Women had to take on work previously done by men, running shops and businesses, working in factories, and managing farms. The war created a generation of widows, orphans, and disabled veterans. Government programs provided support, but resources were limited. Martyrs' families received special privileges, including preference in university admissions and government jobs, creating a new social hierarchy based on sacrifice for the regime. Propaganda saturated daily life. Murals of martyrs appeared on walls throughout cities. Revolutionary songs played on radio and television. Schools taught children about the war and the importance of sacrifice. The regime used the war to strengthen its ideological grip on society and to justify continued restrictions on freedoms. By 1987, the war was going badly for Iran. Iraqi forces had pushed back Iranian salients. International pressure was mounting. The Iranian economy was buckling under the strain. Popular support for the war, once enthusiastic, was eroding as casualties mounted and victory remained elusive. The final blow came in July 1988. The United States Navy shot down Iran Air Flight 655 over the Persian Gulf, killing all 290 passengers and crew, including 66 children. The US claimed the Aegis cruiser USS Vincennes had mistaken the civilian airliner for an attacking fighter jet. For Iranians, the incident seemed to symbolize international indifference to their suffering and the futility of continuing the war. On July 18, 1988, Ayatollah Khomeini announced that Iran would accept UN Security Council Resolution 598, which called for a ceasefire. In a letter explaining his decision, Khomeini wrote that accepting the ceasefire was more deadly than drinking poison, but necessary for the country's survival. A ceasefire took effect on August 20th, 1988. The war ended essentially where it began, with borders unchanged. 8 years of fighting had killed perhaps 500,000 to 1 million people, with Iran suffering the majority of casualties. Hundreds of thousands more were wounded or disabled. Entire cities, particularly Khorramshahr and Abadan, had been destroyed. The economic cost ran into hundreds of billions of dollars for both countries. For Iran, the war had profound consequences. It mobilized the population and allowed the regime to consolidate power in the name of national defense. It created a cult of martyrdom that shaped Iranian culture for decades. It strengthened the Revolutionary Guards, which emerged from the war as a powerful military and economic force. It deepened Iran's international isolation, and it left a generation traumatized by violence and loss, shaping politics and society for decades to come. The war also had a darker coda. In the summer of 1988, as the ceasefire approached, the regime launched a final purge of political prisoners. Thousands of leftist and MEK prisoners, many of whom had been in jail for years and posed no active threat, were brought before kangaroo courts in prisons across Iran. Those who refused to renounce their political beliefs were executed. The exact death toll remains unknown, but estimates range from 3,000 to 5,000 victims. This massacre of political prisoners remains one of the darkest chapters of the Islamic Republic's history, little discussed inside Iran due to continued government sensitivity. Chapter 5: Reconstruction and Pragmatism, 1989 to 1997. Ayatollah Khomeini died on June 3, 1989, at age 86. His death ended an era and forced the regime to confront questions about succession and direction. Khomeini had been the revolution's heart and soul, the source of ultimate authority, and the symbol of Islamic resistance to the West. How could he be replaced? The regime had prepared for this eventuality by grooming Khomeini's successor. Ali Khamenei, who had served as president since 1981, was selected by the Assembly of Experts to become the new supreme leader. The choice was controversial. Khamenei was not a Marja or Grand Ayatollah, and many questioned whether he possessed sufficient religious credentials for the position. But Khamenei had political skills and the support of key power centres, particularly the Revolutionary Guards. To succeed Khamenei as president, Iranians elected Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, a mid-ranking cleric who had served as Speaker of Parliament during the war years. Rafsanjani was a pragmatist who believed Iran needed to rebuild its shattered economy and reduce its international isolation. His presidency from 1989 to 1997 represented an attempt to normalize the revolution and shift from ideological purity to practical governance. Rafsanjani's economic program emphasized reconstruction, privatization, and opening Iran to foreign investment and trade. He sought to rebuild infrastructure destroyed during the war, to revive industries that had collapsed, and to address unemployment and poverty. His government negotiated large development projects, sought foreign loans, and tried to attract international businesses back to Iran. The results were mixed. Some reconstruction occurred, particularly in war-damaged cities. Infrastructure improved, oil production recovered. But corruption flourished as government-connected individuals positioned themselves to profit from privatization and foreign contracts. Inequality widened. Inflation remained high. Many ordinary Iranians saw little improvement in their lives while connected elites grew wealthy. Culturally, the Rafsanjani years saw a slight thaw. Controls on cinema and literature loosened somewhat. Iranian filmmakers like Abbas Kiarostami and Mohsen Makhmalbaf gained international recognition, producing nuanced works that explored Iranian society's complexities within the constraints of censorship. Bookstores offered a wider range of titles. Satellite dishes, though officially banned, proliferated, giving Iranians access to foreign television. Women's lives during this period reflected contradictory trends. The regime maintained strict enforcement of mandatory hijab and gender segregation in public spaces. Women could not shake hands with unrelated men, swim in mixed company, or appear in public without Islamic covering. Legal discrimination remained extensive, with women's testimony in court worth half that of men and women facing restrictions on travel, marriage, and divorce. Yet, women continued to make gains in education and some professional fields. By the early 1990s, women made up over half of university students. They worked as doctors, teachers, engineers, and civil servants in growing numbers. Women's sports programs developed, with female athletes competing in gender-segregated settings or in international competitions abroad while wearing hijab. A subtle but significant shift occurred in how women navigated the regime's restrictions. Rather than simply accepting or resisting the rules, many women found ways to work within the system while pushing its boundaries. The mandatory hijab requirement led to creative interpretations, with women wearing colourful scarves that barely covered their hair and long coats cut to emphasise rather than hide their figures. This practice of bad hijab allowed women to express individuality while technically complying with the law. Women's magazines and publications proliferated during this period, creating spaces for discussion of women's rights, health, and social issues within an Islamic framework. Feminist thinkers like Shala Shirkat, who founded Zanan magazine in 1992, argued that the problem was not Islam itself, but patriarchal interpretations of Islamic law. This Islamic feminism sought reform from within the religious tradition rather than in opposition to it. The Rafsanjani era also saw the emergence of what would later be called the Reform movement. Intellectuals, journalists, students, and even some clerics began questioning aspects of the Islamic Republic's governance while accepting its basic framework. They called for greater political freedoms, rule of law, and civil rights. They argued that an Islamic government could be democratic and that the people's will should shape policy. These reformist ideas found particular resonance among young people who had no memory of the Shah or the revolution. By the mid-1990s, over 60% of Iran's population was under 25. These young Iranians had grown up entirely under the Islamic Republic. They resented restrictions on personal freedom, frustrated by economic stagnation, and increasingly questioned the revolutionary ideology their parents had embraced. Iranian society during the Rafsanjani years developed a distinctive duality. Public spaces were controlled, monitored, and regulated according to the regime's Islamic ideology. Women wore headscarves. Men and women sat in separate sections on buses. Alcohol was banned, Western music was restricted, revolutionary slogans covered walls, but in private spaces, particularly in middle-class homes, a different Iran existed. People hosted parties with music and dancing. Some consumed alcohol, smuggled in, or made at home despite prohibition. Young people socialized across gender lines. Satellite dishes brought in forbidden foreign programming. This divide between public conformity and private freedom became a defining characteristic of life in the Islamic Republic. The regime tolerated this private sphere to some degree, recognizing that attempting to control behavior in private homes would be both impossible and dangerously unpopular. But periodically, morality police would crack down, raiding parties, arresting young people for mingling, or confiscating satellite dishes. These crackdowns were selective and unpredictable, creating a climate of uncertainty and fear. International relations during the Rafsanjani years remained difficult, but showed some improvement from the revolutionary period's extreme isolation. Iran worked to rebuild relationships with European countries and to attract European investment and technology. Relations with Arab neighbours improved somewhat, though suspicion remained high. The relationship with the United States remained frozen, with no diplomatic relations and mutual hostility. Iran's regional posture during this period, involved supporting militant groups opposed to Israel, particularly Hezbollah in Lebanon and Palestinian organizations. This support stemmed from both ideological commitment to the Palestinian cause and strategic interest in extending Iranian influence. It ensured continued American hostility and Israeli enmity, but gained Iran influence among segments of the Arab and Muslim world. By the mid-1990s, it was clear that Rafsanjani's technocratic approach had failed to deliver the prosperity he promised. The economy remained troubled. Unemployment was high, particularly among young people. Corruption was endemic. The gap between rich and poor had widened. Political restrictions remained tight, with limited space for dissent or participation. Yet, the Rafsanjani era had accomplished something perhaps unintended. By focusing on practical governance and economic development rather than revolutionary ideology, Rafsanjani had normalized the Islamic Republic. It was no longer a revolutionary movement, but a state with mundane concerns about economic growth, infrastructure, and services. This shift laid the groundwork for what would come next. Chapter 6. The Reform Movement and its Defeat, 1997 to 2005. The 1997 presidential election transformed Iranian politics. The establishment expected Mohammad Nouri, the conservative Speaker of Parliament, to win easily. Instead, Mohammad Khatami, a relatively unknown mid-level cleric and former culture minister, won in a landslide with 69% of the vote. Khatami's victory was driven by overwhelming support from women, young people, and educated urban voters who longed for change. Khatami campaigned on a platform of civil society, rule of law, and dialogue among civilizations. He spoke of creating a government that served the people and respected their rights. He promised cultural opening and greater personal freedoms. His gentle manner and intellectual approach contrasted sharply with the harsh rhetoric that had dominated Iranian politics since the revolution. The excitement Khatami's election generated was palpable, particularly among young people and women. Crowds celebrated in the streets. Voters felt they had participated in meaningful political change. The Second of Khordad movement, named for the Persian calendar date of Khatami's election, represented hope that the Islamic Republic could reform itself from within. Khatami's presidency, which lasted from 1997 to 2005, saw an explosion of political and cultural activity. Newspapers and journals proliferated, with reformist publications pushing the boundaries of acceptable discourse. They criticized government policies, discussed taboo topics, and provided platforms for voices calling for change. At the movement's peak, Iran had a vibrant and relatively free press, unprecedented in the post-revolutionary period. Universities became centers of political activism. Student groups organized rallies, debates, and protests. Young people felt empowered to speak out and demand change. Women students were particularly active, pushing for greater rights and challenging gender discrimination. Civil society organizations emerged to work on issues from environmental protection to women's rights to poverty alleviation. These groups operated in a grey zone, sometimes tolerated and sometimes harassed by authorities, but their mere existence represented a significant opening. The cultural sphere flourished under Khatami, who, as former culture minister, understood the art's importance. Iranian cinema reached new heights of international recognition with films by Abbas Kiarostami, Jafar Panahi, Samira Makhmalbaf, and others winning prizes at major film festivals. These films often subtly critiqued Iranian society and explored themes of freedom, justice, and human dignity within the constraints of censorship. Women's rights became a major focus of the reform movement. Women activists, journalists, and lawyers organized campaigns around specific issues. The campaign to reform discriminatory family law gathered signatures and raised awareness about legal inequalities. Women's sports advocates pushed for better facilities and opportunities. Professional women demanded equal pay and opportunities for advancement. The 1 Million Signatures campaign, launched in 2006, slightly after Khatami left office, but building on the groundwork laid during his presidency, sought to collect signatures supporting an end to legal discrimination against women. Activists approached women on the street, in parks, and in their homes, explaining how the law discriminated against them and asking them to sign the petition. The campaign faced government harassment, with many activists arrested, but it succeeded in raising awareness and building networks that would prove important in later protests. But the reform movement faced powerful opposition from the very beginning. Conservative elements in the system, particularly the Supreme Leader and the Revolutionary Guards, saw reform as a threat to the revolution's values and to their power. They used the constitutional levers at their disposal to block Khatami's agenda. The Guardian Council vetoed reformist legislation passed by Parliament. The judiciary, controlled by conservatives, arrested reformist journalists and activists. Newspapers were shut down on spurious pretexts. By some accounts, more than 100 reformist publications were closed during Khatami's presidency, often immediately after being shut down to reopen under a new name before being shut down again. Violence was also deployed against reformers. In 1998, several intellectuals and activists were murdered in what became known as the chain murders. The killings were eventually traced to rogue elements in the intelligence ministry, though many believed the truth went higher. The murders sent a clear message about the price of dissent. In July 1999, student protests at Tehran University were violently suppressed by police and vigilantes. The protests had begun over the closure of a reformist newspaper, but escalated into broader demonstrations against the regime. The crackdown was brutal, with dormitories raided, students beaten, and several killed. The 1999 student protests marked a turning point, showing the limits of reform and the regime's willingness to use force to maintain control. Women continued to face systematic discrimination despite the reform movement's efforts. The courts routinely ruled against women in divorce cases, giving custody of children to fathers and denying women's claims to marital property. Women could not travel abroad without their husband's permission. Polygamy remained legal, though relatively rare. In cases of wrongful death, a woman's life was legally valued at half that of a man's. Yet women found ways to resist within the constraints. Women lawyers like Shireen Ebadi, who would win the Nobel Peace Prize in 2003, took on cases challenging discriminatory laws and defending women's rights. Women filmmakers, writers, and artists used their work to highlight women's experiences and challenge stereotypes. Female athletes pushed boundaries, competing internationally while complying with hijab requirements. The mandatory hijab remained perhaps the most visible symbol of the regime's control over women's bodies and lives. The morality police, officially known as Gasht-e-Irshad or guidance patrols, stopped women whose headscarves showed too much hair, whose coats were too short or too tight, or who wore makeup deemed excessive. Women could be detained, forced to sign pledges to respect Islamic dress, and in some cases prosecuted. But even hijab became a site of resistance. Women wore their scarves as far back on their heads as possible. They chose bright colours and fashionable styles. They used makeup and styled their visible hair elaborately. This bad hijab was a daily act of small-scale resistance, a way of claiming autonomy within a system that sought to control them. The reform movement's failure to deliver meaningful change became clear during Khatami's second term. He won re-election in 2001 with an even larger majority, showing continued popular support. But the legislative and constitutional obstacles to reform proved insurmountable. The Guardian Council disqualified thousands of reformist candidates from running for parliament in 2004, ensuring conservative control. Reformist policies were vetoed or ignored. Frustrated by blocked reforms and continued repression, many reformist supporters became disillusioned. This disillusionment opened the door for a conservative backlash. In the 2005 presidential election, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the conservative mayor of Tehran, won on a populist platform promising to address corruption and share Iran's oil wealth with ordinary people. His victory marked the end of the reform era and the beginning of a new phase of conservative rule. The reform movement had not been a complete failure. It had shown that millions of Iranians wanted change. It had created networks of activists and organizations that would endure. It had proven that elections could matter, even in an authoritarian system. And it had raised expectations about freedom and rights that would shape Iranian politics for decades to come. But the movement had also revealed the Islamic Republic's fundamental nature. Real power rested not with elected officials, but with unelected institutions controlled by conservatives. The system had mechanisms to block democratic change, and the regime would use force if necessary to maintain control. These lessons would inform later protest movements, making them more radical and less willing to work within the system. Chapter 7. The Ahmadinejad Years, 2005 to 2013. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was an unlikely president. A civil engineer and veteran of the Iran-Iraq War, he had served as mayor of Tehran from 2003 to 2005. He came from a humble background and cultivated a man of the people image, wearing simple clothes and living modestly. His campaign promised to fight corruption and bring oil revenues to people's tables. Ahmadinejad's presidency from 2005 to 2013 marked a sharp turn away from reform. He rolled back the limited openings of the Khatami era. He appointed hardliners to key positions. He emphasized revolutionary ideology over pragmatism, and his confrontational approach to foreign policy, particularly regarding Iran's nuclear program, increased international pressure on Iran. Domestically, Ahmadinejad pursued populist economic policies that distributed cash payments and subsidies to lower-income Iranians. He travelled extensively throughout the country, particularly to rural areas and small towns often neglected by Tehran-based politicians. He cultivated support among the poor and among Revolutionary Guard members and their families. But Ahmadinejad's economic policies proved disastrous. Inflation soared, reaching rates of 25% or higher. The currency lost value. Unemployment remained high. The distribution of oil revenues through subsidies created dependencies but didn't generate productive investment or sustainable growth. Mismanagement and corruption wasted resources. International sanctions imposed over Iran's nuclear program increasingly strangled the economy. The nuclear issue dominated Ahmadinejad's foreign policy. Iran's nuclear program had begun under the Shah with American support. After the revolution, the program languished during the war years, but resumed in the 1980s and 90s with Russian and Pakistani assistance. By the early 2000s, Iran had developed an indigenous nuclear fuel cycle capability, including uranium enrichment. The United States and Israel argued that Iran's nuclear program was aimed at developing nuclear weapons, pointing to undeclared facilities and suspicious activities. Iran insisted its program was purely for peaceful purposes, particularly electricity generation, and that it had a right under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to develop nuclear technology. Under Ahmadinejad, Iran took a confrontational stance. He announced that Iran had joined the nuclear club and that Iran's nuclear rights were non-negotiable. He oversaw expansion of uranium enrichment, installation of advanced centrifuges, and construction of new facilities. International inspectors documented Iran's growing capabilities with alarm. The United Nations Security Council passed multiple rounds of sanctions targeting Iran's nuclear program, financial system, and oil exports. The United States and European Union imposed additional sanctions. These sanctions, particularly those targeting Iran's oil exports and access to the international financial system, had severe economic effects. Oil revenues declined. Foreign investment dried up. Iranians struggled to obtain needed imports, including medicines and industrial components. Ahmadinejad's foreign policy rhetoric was also deliberately provocative. He questioned the Holocaust's historical reality, calling it a myth. He called for Israel to be wiped off the map, though the exact translation of his Farsi statement remains disputed. He framed Iran as the leader of resistance to Western imperialism and Zionism. This rhetoric alarmed Israel and the United States and contributed to increased sanctions and isolation. Iran's regional policy during this period involved active support for proxy forces throughout the Middle East. Hezbollah in Lebanon received weapons, training, and funding from Iran. Iran supported Shiite militias in Iraq following the American invasion in 2003, contributing to instability and American casualties. Iran backed the Assad regime in Syria and Palestinian militant groups opposed to Israel. This regional activism extended Iranian influence, but also created enemies and increased the likelihood of conflict. The 2009 presidential election became a crisis that shook the Islamic Republic to its foundations. Ahmadinejad ran for re-election against several candidates, including Mir Hossein Mousavi, a former prime minister who had led Iran during the war years. Mousavi ran as a reformist, promising to reverse Ahmadinejad's policies and improve Iran's international standing. His campaign attracted enormous enthusiasm, particularly among young people, women, and the urban middle class. When the Interior Ministry announced on election night that Ahmadinejad had won with 63% of the vote, Mousavi's supporters were shocked and disbelieving. The announced results seemed implausible given the campaign's energy and the widespread sense that Mousavi was ahead. Within hours, millions poured into the streets to protest what they believed was a stolen election. The Green Movement, named for Mousavi's campaign colour, represented the largest protest in Iran since the revolution. For months, protesters filled the streets of Tehran and other cities, chanting, "Where is my vote?" and demanding the election be overturned. The protests were largely peaceful and creative, with protesters using silence, symbolic gestures, and social media to organize and spread their message. The regime's response was brutal. Basij militias and Revolutionary Guards attacked protesters with batons, tear gas, and in some cases live ammunition. Thousands were arrested. Protesters were beaten, tortured, and sexually assaulted in detention. Show trials were held, with prisoners forced to confess to being agents of foreign powers. At least 70 protesters were killed, though the true number may be higher. One death in particular became symbolic of the movement. Neda Aga Sultan, a young woman, was shot and killed by a Basij militiaman on June 20th, 2009. A bystander captured her death on video, which spread virally online. The image of Neda dying on a Tehran street became an international symbol of the Green Movement and of the regime's brutality. Women were central to the Green Movement, both as protesters and as targets of repression. Women organized and participated in demonstrations, often placing themselves in front of male protesters to reduce the likelihood of violence. Female journalists and bloggers documented the protests and the crackdown. Women's rights activists saw the Green Movement as an opportunity to advance their agenda within a broader democratic movement. But women also suffered disproportionately in the crackdown. Sexual assault and rape in detention were used as tools of repression, with female prisoners particularly vulnerable. The regime understood that attacking women's honor and bodies was an effective way to terrorize families and communities. Many women were too ashamed to speak publicly about what had happened to them, though some courageously testified about their experiences. The Green Movement was ultimately suppressed, though it took months of sustained repression. By early 2010, street protests had been crushed. The movement's leaders, including Mousavi and fellow candidate Mehdi Karoubi, were placed under house arrest, where they would remain for years. Activists and journalists filled prisons. The regime had weathered its greatest challenge since the revolution, but at tremendous cost. The Green Movement's suppression had several important consequences. It delegitimized the regime in the eyes of millions of Iranians, particularly the educated and urban middle class. It showed that the regime would use extreme violence to maintain power. It demonstrated that reform from within the system was impossible, and it created networks of activists and raised political consciousness that would inform later protests. Life for ordinary Iranians during the Ahmadinejad years was increasingly difficult. Inflation eroded savings and wages. Unemployment, particularly among educated youth, remained high. Young people with university degrees drove taxis or worked in menial jobs because professional opportunities were scarce. Many educated Iranians emigrated, creating a brain drain that hurt the economy and society. Women continued to face restrictions and discrimination. The morality police remained active, harassing women over hijab. Universities imposed quotas limiting women's enrollment in certain fields. Employment discrimination was common, with women earning less than men for the same work and facing barriers to advancement. Domestic violence remained a serious problem, with limited legal recourse for victims. Yet Iranian women also showed remarkable resilience and creativity. Women dominated university enrollment, making up over 60% of students. They worked in nearly all professional fields, though in smaller numbers than men. They ran businesses, practiced law and medicine, taught in universities, and contributed to arts and culture. They navigated the system's restrictions while finding ways to pursue their goals. The gap between public and private life widened during this period. In public, people conformed to the regime's requirements, wearing proper hijab, avoiding mixed-gender socializing, and watching what they said. But in private homes, particularly among the middle class, people lived differently. They hosted mixed parties with alcohol and music. They watched foreign movies on satellite TV. They discussed politics openly and criticized the regime. This duality created psychological stress. People felt they had to maintain two personas, one for public and one for private. They had to constantly calculate the risks of their behavior and speech. Trust became scarce, as informers were everywhere. The society developed a culture of suspicion and self-censorship that corroded social bonds. By the end of Ahmadinejad's second term, Iran was in crisis. The economy was in shambles. International isolation was nearly complete. Society was polarized and traumatized by the Green Movement's suppression. The regime's legitimacy was badly damaged. Change was necessary, but what form it would take remained unclear. Chapter 8, Rouhani's Interlude and the Nuclear Deal, 2013 to 2021. Hassan Rouhani, a mid-ranking cleric and veteran of Iran's nuclear negotiations, won the 2013 presidential election on a platform of moderation and economic improvement. His campaign focused heavily on resolving the nuclear crisis and lifting sanctions. He promised to improve Iran's international standing and create economic opportunities, particularly for young people. Rouhani's election reflected public exhaustion with Ahmadinejad's confrontational approach and desire for economic relief. The sanctions were severely impacting ordinary Iranians. Inflation was over 30%. The currency had lost half its value. Medicines were scarce. The middle class was being crushed. Iranians wanted change. The centerpiece of Rouhani's presidency became the nuclear negotiations with the United States and other world powers. These talks, which had proceeded fitfully for years, accelerated after Rouhani's election. Rouhani appointed Mohammad Javad Zarif, a sophisticated and Western-educated diplomat, as foreign minister to lead Iran's negotiating team. After nearly 2 years of intensive negotiations, Iran and the P5+1, consisting of the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Russia, and China, reached the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, commonly known as the Iran Nuclear Deal, in July 2015. The agreement was complex and technical, but its basic outline was clear. Iran would accept strict limits on its nuclear program and allow intensive international inspections in exchange for the lifting of nuclear-related sanctions. The deal specifics included Iran reducing its stockpile of enriched uranium by 98%, limiting enrichment to 3.67%, far below weapons-grade levels, reducing its number of centrifuges from about 19,000 to about 6,000, and accepting comprehensive International Atomic Energy Agency monitoring. In return, the United States, European Union, and United Nations would lift nuclear-related sanctions, freeing up tens of billions of dollars in frozen assets and allowing Iran to resume oil exports. The nuclear deal was controversial in both Iran and the United States. Iranian hardliners argued it gave away too much for too little and that Iran should never have agreed to limits on its nuclear program. American critics claimed it didn't go far enough and that Iran would eventually develop nuclear weapons anyway. But Rouhani and the Obama administration argued the deal was the best available option to prevent an Iranian nuclear weapon and to begin reducing tensions. The deal's implementation in January 2016 brought immediate economic benefits. Frozen assets were released, oil exports increased, foreign businesses began exploring opportunities in Iran. There was hope that economic improvement would follow, creating jobs and improving living standards. But the economic benefits were limited and slow to materialize. European banks remained cautious about Iran business, fearing American secondary sanctions. Foreign investment was far less than anticipated. Corruption and mismanagement limited the sanctions relief's impact on ordinary Iranians. Many felt that the economic gains went to elites and connected insiders rather than to the broader population. Women's situation during the Rouhani years showed some modest improvements but continued to face fundamental restrictions. Rouhani appointed women to visible positions, including as vice presidents and government ministers. He spoke of the need to address discrimination and to expand women's rights. Women's rights activists operated with somewhat less harassment than under Ahmadinejad, yet the basic structures of discrimination remained intact. Mandatory hijab was still enforced, though perhaps slightly less aggressively. Legal discrimination continued in family law, inheritance, and testimony. Women still needed their husband's permission to travel. Gender segregation remained the norm in public spaces. Women's sports still faced restrictions and lack of support. One telling incident illustrated the continued restrictions. When Iranian women wanted to attend men's soccer matches, a popular pastime from which they were banned, they faced arrest if they tried to enter stadiums. In 2018, a woman known as the Blue Girl, who had tried to enter a stadium disguised as a man, set herself on fire outside a courthouse where she faced trial. Her death sparked international outrage and renewed focus on the stadium ban, but the restriction remained in place. The nuclear deal's limited duration proved to be its fatal flaw. In May 2018, President Donald Trump announced that the United States would withdraw from the agreement and reimpose sanctions. Trump argued the deal was poorly negotiated, didn't address Iran's missile program or regional activities, and had sunset provisions that would eventually allow Iran to resume its nuclear program. The American withdrawal from the nuclear deal was devastating for Rouhani and for Iranians who had hoped for economic improvement. The sanctions returned with even greater force. The United States pursued a maximum pressure campaign designed to cripple Iran's economy and force it to negotiate a new, more comprehensive deal. The European Union tried to maintain the agreement and create mechanisms to allow trade with Iran, despite American sanctions. But these efforts largely failed. The renewed sanctions had severe effects. Oil exports dropped to their lowest levels in decades. Inflation soared again. The currency collapsed, losing 2/3 of its value. Unemployment increased. Access to imported goods became difficult. Medicine shortages became acute, with cancer patients and others with serious illnesses unable to obtain needed treatments. The economy contracted sharply. In November 2019, the government announced a sharp increase in gasoline prices to address budget deficits caused by sanctions. The price increase sparked massive protests across the country. Unlike previous protests centered in Tehran, these protests erupted in working-class cities and towns, drawing participants from the lower economic classes hit hardest by the economic crisis. The November 2019 protests were met with extreme violence. Security forces killed hundreds of protesters, with estimates ranging from 300 to over 1,500. Thousands were arrested. The internet was shut down nationwide for several days to prevent organization and documentation. The crackdown was the deadliest since the revolution, showing the regime's willingness to use lethal force to maintain control. The protests revealed deep alienation from the regime among working-class Iranians. These were not middle-class reformists calling for civil rights, but poor people demanding economic relief. Their chants targeted the regime's regional spending, asking why Iran spent money supporting groups in Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine while Iranians struggled. The protests showed that economic grievances could mobilize even those who had been the regime's traditional base. Women participated actively in the November protests, facing violence alongside male protesters. Female protesters were shot, beaten, and arrested. Some testified about sexual assault in detention. The regime's violence did not discriminate by gender, but women's participation showed their frustration extended beyond traditional women's rights issues to broader economic and political grievances. By the end of Rouhani's presidency in 2021, Iran was in many ways worse off than when he began. The nuclear deal had collapsed. Sanctions were more severe than ever. The economy was in crisis. The regime's legitimacy was further damaged by its violent suppression of protests. And the COVID-19 pandemic had hit Iran hard, with hundreds of thousands of deaths and economic disruption adding to the existing crises. The pandemic revealed the regime's incompetence and dishonesty. Officials initially denied the virus's presence in Iran, then downplayed its severity. The health system was overwhelmed. Medical supplies were inadequate. The government's response was chaotic and ineffective. Iranians watched officials contract and die from the virus while spouting propaganda about the situation being under control. Rouhani's presidency had promised moderation and improvement, but delivered disappointment. The nuclear deal's collapse wasn't entirely his fault. The American withdrawal was a unilateral decision, but his inability to deliver economic benefits or to address domestic problems left many Iranians disillusioned. The hope that had greeted his election had given way to resignation and anger. Chapter 9. Raisi's presidency and increasing repression, 2021 to 2022. The 2021 presidential election was a farce that highlighted the regime's declining legitimacy. The Guardian Council disqualified all serious reformist and moderate candidates, leaving only hardliners on the ballot. The most prominent candidate was Ebrahim Raisi, the Chief Justice and a conservative cleric closely aligned with Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Raisi was a controversial figure with a dark past. As a young prosecutor in the 1980s, he had served on death committees that sentenced thousands of political prisoners to execution. His role in these mass executions was well known and had prevented him from travelling to many countries where he might face prosecution. His elevation to the presidency sent a clear message about the regime's character and priorities. Turnout in the 2021 election was the lowest since the revolution, officially 49%, but likely lower. Many Iranians boycotted the election in protest. The regime tried to frame the low turnout as the result of COVID concerns, but everyone understood it reflected deep disillusionment with a political system that offered no real choice and no possibility of meaningful change. Raisi's presidency, which began in August 2021, marked a further shift toward repression. He appointed hardliners to his cabinet. He gave security forces greater latitude to crack down on dissent. He emphasized revolutionary ideology and resistance to the West. Whatever limited political opening had existed under Rouhani contracted further. The morality police became more aggressive in enforcing mandatory hijab and Islamic dress codes. Women reported being stopped more frequently and treated more harshly. The fear that had somewhat relaxed under Rouhani intensified again. Women had to be more careful about their appearance and behaviour in public. On September 13th, 2022, an event occurred that would trigger the largest protest movement since the revolution. Mahsa Jina Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish woman visiting Tehran with her family, was arrested by the morality police for allegedly wearing her headscarf improperly. She was taken to a detention centre for re-education. Several hours later, she collapsed and fell into a coma. She died 3 days later. The circumstances of Amini's death remain disputed. Authorities claimed she had a heart attack. Her family and witnesses said she was beaten. Medical evidence suggested severe head trauma consistent with a beating. Whatever the exact cause, Mahsa Amini died in the custody of the morality police for the crime of improper hijab. Her death sparked outrage that had been building for decades. At her funeral in her hometown of Sachez in Kurdistan province, mourners chanted "Death to the dictator," and women removed their headscarves in protest. The protests spread quickly across Iran, drawing in millions of participants from all segments of society. The protests that followed Mahsa Amini's death were different from previous protest movements. They were more radical, with protesters explicitly rejecting the Islamic Republic and calling for its overthrow rather than its reform. They were more widespread, occurring in cities and towns throughout Iran, including areas that had been regime strongholds. They were led by women and youth, with young women at the forefront. And they used the slogan "Woman, Life, Freedom" to encapsulate their demands. Women led the protests in the most direct and powerful way possible by removing their hijabs in public. Thousands of women took off and burned their headscarves in the street, cut their hair in protest, and walked without head covering in defiance of the law. This was not symbolic protest, but direct action, reclaiming control over their own bodies and lives. The protests spread to universities, with students, particularly female students, leading demonstrations. High school students, including teenage girls, joined the protests, showing courage that shocked and inspired their elders. Workers struck. Shopkeepers closed their businesses in solidarity. Ethnic minorities, particularly Kurds and Baloch, joined the protests, bringing their own grievances against the regime. The regime responded with characteristic violence. Security forces shot protesters with live ammunition. Hundreds were killed, including many children. Thousands were arrested. Some prisoners were tortured. Several protesters were executed after show trials, charged with vague crimes like waging war against God. The crackdown was severe and sustained, yet the protests continued for months. The Woman, Life, Freedom protests represented a fundamental challenge to the Islamic Republic. Unlike the Green Movement, which had sought to work within the system and had focused on electoral fraud, these protests rejected the system itself. Protesters burned images of Khomeini and Khamenei. They chanted against the Islamic Republic. They called for secular democracy. The protests were explicitly revolutionary. Women's participation was central, not just in numbers, but in the protests' character and demands. For the first time since the revolution, women's freedom was understood not as a side issue, but as the core issue. The mandatory hijab, imposed in 1979 and enforced for over 4 decades, was identified as a symbol of the regime's oppression and a target for resistance. When women removed their headscarves, they were challenging the foundation of the Islamic Republic's ideology. The protests also united different segments of society in unprecedented ways. Middle-class professionals, working-class youth, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, and secular urbanites all participated. Women and men protested together. The geographic spread was remarkable, from wealthy North Tehran to poor southern neighborhoods, from Kurdish cities to Baloch areas to cosmopolitan Isfahan and Shiraz. International support for the protests was significant. The Iranian diaspora organized demonstrations worldwide in solidarity. Western governments condemned the regime's violence and imposed additional sanctions. Social media amplified protesters' voices and documented the regime's brutality, but no meaningful international intervention occurred, and the protesters received no material support from abroad. The regime gradually suppressed the protests through sustained violence and mass arrests. By early 2023, street protests had largely ended, though sporadic actions continued. The regime had weathered another major challenge, but at tremendous cost. It had been forced to kill hundreds of its own citizens, many of them teenagers and young women. It had imprisoned tens of thousands. It had lost whatever remaining legitimacy it possessed in the eyes of a large portion of the population. The aftermath of the protests saw continued repression. The regime executed protesters, including Mohammad Gobadlu, who was on the autism spectrum, and Mohammad Rouhani, sending a message about the price of dissent. Actresses, musicians, and other public figures who had supported the protests faced arrest or exile. Universities were purged of student activists. The security apparatus tightened its grip on society. Yet the protests had achieved something important. They had shown that millions of Iranians, particularly women and youth, fundamentally rejected the Islamic Republic. They had demonstrated new forms of resistance and new levels of courage. They had put women's freedom at the center of Iran's political discourse, and they had created networks and raised consciousness that would shape future resistance. For women, the protests represented both a high point of resistance and a moment of tremendous cost. Women had led with extraordinary courage, facing bullets and batons while demanding their freedom. But women also paid a heavy price, with many killed, imprisoned, and tortured. The mandatory hijab remained in place, enforced perhaps somewhat less aggressively in the immediate aftermath, but still the law. Chapter 10, Iran Today, 2023 to 2025. Iran in 2025 is a society in crisis, suspended between an aging revolutionary regime that has lost legitimacy and an uncertain future that cannot yet be born. The contradictions and tensions that have characterized the Islamic Republic since its inception have intensified to a breaking point. The economy continues to struggle under the weight of sanctions, mismanagement, and corruption. Inflation fluctuates between 30 and 40% annually, eroding purchasing power and devastating the middle class. The currency, the rial, has lost over 90% of its value since 2015. Basic goods are expensive and sometimes scarce. Young people, even those with university degrees, struggle to find employment that pays living wages. The brain drain continues as educated Iranians leave for opportunities abroad. Doctors, engineers, scientists, and other professionals emigrate in large numbers, seeking better lives in Europe, North America, or the Persian Gulf states. This exodus deprives Iran of talent it desperately needs, while reflecting the deep pessimism many feel about the country's future. The regime itself shows signs of sclerosis. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is in his mid-80s and reportedly in poor health. Succession planning occurs in secret, but the selection of his replacement will be a crucial moment that could destabilize the regime. The Revolutionary Guards have grown into a massive economic and military force with interests in everything from construction to oil to telecommunications. They are now as much a corrupt business conglomerate as a military force, though still capable of repression. President Raisi died in a helicopter crash in May 2024 under circumstances that sparked conspiracy theories. He was replaced through a controlled election by another hardliner, Masoud Pezeshkian, who offered limited promises of moderation but operates within the same restrictive system. Real power remains with the supreme leader and the security apparatus, not with elected officials. The nuclear program remains in a dangerous limbo. After the United States withdrew from the nuclear deal, Iran gradually violated its limits, enriching uranium to 60%, close to weapons-grade levels, and installing advanced centrifuges. The International Atomic Energy Agency reports that Iran has enough enriched uranium to produce several nuclear weapons if it chose to do so, though it has not taken that final step. Negotiations have occurred sporadically, but without success. The situation remains tense, with the possibility of Israeli or American military action always present. Regionally, Iran maintains its network of proxy forces, but faces challenges. Hezbollah in Lebanon is strong, but constrained by Lebanon's economic collapse. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq face opposition from Iraqi nationalists. The Assad regime in Syria survived its civil war with Iranian help, but is weak and dependent. Iran's regional influence remains significant but has not translated into strategic advantage or economic benefit. The mandatory hijab policy has entered a strange phase. After the woman, life, freedom protests, the regime initially doubled down on enforcement, deploying morality police more aggressively and installing cameras to identify women without proper hijab. But resistance continued. Many women, particularly in Tehran and other major cities, now walk the streets with their hair partially or fully uncovered, daring authorities to stop them. The regime has been inconsistent in enforcement, sometimes cracking down and sometimes looking the other way. This creates a confusing situation where the level of enforcement varies by neighborhood, by time of day, and by the woman's apparent social class. Wealthy women in upscale North Tehran neighborhoods often go uncovered without consequence, while poor women in traditional areas face harassment. This class-based double standard breeds resentment and highlights the regime's hypocrisy. Women's participation in universities remains high, with women making up the majority of students in many fields, but discrimination in employment remains severe. Women face barriers to advancement, earn less than men, and are excluded from many positions. The labour force participation rate for women is around 15%, one of the lowest in the world, reflecting both discrimination and social pressures on women to prioritise family over career. The legal system continues to discriminate against women systematically. A woman's testimony is worth half that of a man's in court. Women receive half the inheritance that men do. Women need their husband's permission to travel abroad. Polygamy is legal, though uncommon. Temporary marriage, or sihe, allows men to take multiple wives for specified periods, in practice sanctioning prostitution under a religious veneer. Domestic violence remains a serious problem with inadequate legal protection. Marital rape is not recognized as a crime. Women who flee abusive husbands have limited options and may lose custody of their children. Shelters and support services are scarce. Many women endure abuse because they have no alternative. Yet Iranian women continue to resist in countless ways. They pursue education and careers despite obstacles. They use social media to organize and raise awareness. They challenge discriminatory laws through the courts when possible. They mentor and support each other. They find ways to live as freely as possible within the constraints they face. Their resilience is remarkable. Young people, who make up a large portion of the population, are particularly alienated from the regime. They have grown up entirely under the Islamic Republic and have no nostalgia for the revolution or its values. They resent restrictions on personal freedom, frustrated by economic hardship, and increasingly connected to the outside world through the internet and satellite television. They see the gap between their lives and those of young people in other countries and wonder why they must accept such limitations. The internet has become a battleground. The regime tries to control online content through censorship, blocking of websites and social media platforms, and surveillance. But Iranians are adept at circumventing these controls using VPNs and other tools. Social media platforms banned in Iran, like Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, are widely used by Iranians despite the blocks. The regime has created its own social media platforms, but cannot compete with the appeal of global networks. The generational divide is stark. Older Iranians who remember the revolution and the war years may still support the regime or at least accept it, but younger Iranians overwhelmingly reject it. Surveys, when conducted by independent organizations, consistently show that young Iranians want political freedom, economic opportunity, and normal relations with the world. They are tired of being international pariahs and sacrificing for revolutionary ideology they don't share. How ordinary Iranians feel about the Islamic regime varies by demographic and experience, but certain patterns are clear. The regime has lost most of the middle class, which sees it as corrupt, incompetent, and oppressive. The working class is deeply frustrated by economic hardship and sees the regime as having failed to deliver on its promises of social justice. Rural areas and small towns are less hostile but increasingly pragmatic and focused on economic concerns rather than ideological commitment. Religious minorities, including Baha'is, Christians, and Sunni Muslims, face systematic discrimination and persecution. The Baha'i community, in particular, is denied basic rights. Baha'is cannot attend university, hold government jobs, or practice their faith openly. Many have been imprisoned for their beliefs. Other religious minorities face varying degrees of discrimination, depending on the regime's level of paranoia at any given moment. Ethnic minorities also harbour grievances. Kurds, who have a history of resistance to central government control, maintain low-level insurgency in Kurdish areas. The regime responds with repression, including executions of Kurdish activists. Baluchis face similar oppression. Azerbaijanis, Arabs, and Turkmen all have complaints about discrimination and neglect. In conversations in homes, taxis, and shops, when Iranians feel safe to speak candidly, they express exhaustion, frustration, and often despair. They talk about wanting normal lives without constant fear and restrictions. They complain about corruption, with stories of officials and their families living lavishly while ordinary people struggle. They wonder when change will come and whether it can come without violence. Many Iranians maintain a careful duality, publicly conforming while privately living differently. They have become experts at reading social situations, at knowing when they can speak freely and when they must watch their words. This constant calculation is psychologically exhausting and socially corrosive, breeding cynicism and mistrust. Despite everything, Iranian society shows remarkable vitality. Iranian cinema continues to produce world-class films despite censorship. Iranian literature thrives, with writers finding ways to explore social and political themes within constraints. Iranian music, particularly underground and diaspora artists, creates innovative work. Iranian technology entrepreneurs build startups despite economic challenges. Iranians travel when they can, study abroad when possible, and maintain connections with the wider world. The question on many minds is what comes next. The regime shows no sign of fundamental reform. The supreme leader and security apparatus will not willingly relinquish power. But the status quo seems increasingly unsustainable. Economic crisis, political illegitimacy, generational change, and social fragmentation all point toward an uncertain future. Some Iranians hope for gradual reform, though the failure of previous reform movements makes this seem unlikely. Some want revolution, though the memory of how the last revolution was hijacked gives pause. Some want foreign intervention, though the disasters in Iraq and Libya serve as cautionary tales. Many simply want to leave and build lives elsewhere. Women, particularly, seem increasingly unwilling to accept the status quo. The woman, life, freedom protests showed that women will risk everything for freedom. The continued resistance to mandatory hijab shows that compliance can no longer be taken for granted. A future Iran will have to grapple with women's demands for equality, whether the regime likes it or not. The comparison between pre-revolutionary Iran and today is complex. In some ways, Iran has made progress. Literacy rates are far higher, infrastructure is better, healthcare is more widely available. Women's education rates exceed pre-revolutionary levels. Life expectancy has increased significantly. But in other ways, Iran has regressed. Personal freedoms are more restricted. Political participation is less meaningful. Economic opportunity is more limited for many. International isolation is greater. The quality of governance is worse in many respects. And the gap between the regime and the people is far wider than it ever was under the Shah. Many older Iranians, particularly women who remember the freedoms of the pre-revolutionary period, feel a sense of loss. They remember being able to choose their clothing, socialize freely, and participate in a vibrant cultural scene. They see photographs of their younger selves in miniskirts and at mixed parties and wonder how things changed so drastically. They struggle to explain to their daughters and granddaughters what was lost. Younger Iranians who have no memory of the pre-revolutionary period learn about it through their parents' and grandparents' stories and through photographs and films. They often romanticize that era, imagining it as a time of freedom and opportunity. The reality was more complex, with serious problems of dictatorship, inequality, and repression. But the freedom that existed, particularly for women and in cultural expression, seems remarkable compared to today's restrictions. The Islamic Revolution promised justice, independence, and Islamic values. It delivered authoritarianism, isolation, and rigid social control. It promised to empower the dispossessed and create a more equitable society. It created new elites connected to the Revolutionary Guards and clerical establishment while leaving many in poverty. It promised a government guided by Islamic principles. It created a regime that uses religion as a tool of repression while clerics live in luxury. For ordinary Iranians, particularly those without connections to the regime, life is a daily struggle to make ends meet, navigate restrictions, and maintain hope. They work hard, raise families, and try to create moments of happiness within the constraints they face. They gather with friends and family in private spaces where they can let their guard down. They find small acts of resistance, like playing forbidden music or wearing colourful headscarves. They endure. But endurance is not acceptance. Beneath the surface of daily life, there is deep anger and frustration. People are tired of being told how to dress, what to think, and how to live. They are tired of seeing their children without opportunity. They are tired of international isolation and economic hardship. They are tired of a government that seems more concerned with ideology and regional adventurism than with their welfare. The regime knows this and responds with increasing repression. The security apparatus is massive, with the Revolutionary Guards, the Basij militia, the regular police, intelligence agencies, and morality police, all monitoring and controlling the population. Surveillance has increased. with cameras in public spaces and online monitoring. The tools of control have become more sophisticated, even as the will to resist has also grown. What happens next is genuinely uncertain. The regime could limp along for years or decades, maintaining control through repression, while the economy deteriorates and society fragments. It could face another uprising that, this time, succeeds in toppling it, though the cost would be high and the outcome unpredictable. It could undergo a managed transition to a more moderate system, though there is little sign of this possibility. External events, from war to economic collapse to the supreme leader's death, could trigger crisis and change. For now, Iran exists in a state of suspended animation, a society filled with energy and talent held back by a sclerotic regime, a people longing for freedom constrained by an ideology they no longer believe in, a nation with a proud history and great potential trapped in a system that serves neither its past nor its future. Conclusion. We have journeyed through 46 years of Iranian history, from the revolutionary fervour of 1979 to the exhausted stalemate of 2025. We have seen how a diverse revolutionary coalition overthrew a monarchy and then watched as that coalition fractured and one faction imposed its vision on the entire nation. We have witnessed the terrible cost of war, the failure of reform movements, and the courage of ordinary people, particularly women, who continue to resist oppression. The story of modern Iran is ultimately a human story, about people trying to create better lives for themselves and their children, about dreams deferred and freedoms denied, about resilience in the face of repression. It is the story of women who were told to cover themselves and stay home, but who instead pursued education and careers and now demand full equality. It is the story of young people who refuse to accept the limitations placed on them by a system they had no role in creating. It is also a story that is not yet finished. The Islamic Republic exists in a state of crisis, its legitimacy exhausted, its economic model failed, its ideology rejected by much of the population. How this story ends remains to be seen, but it will be written by the Iranian people themselves, the women who remove their headscarves in defiance, the young people who chant for freedom, the workers who strike for fair wages, and the ordinary citizens who endure and resist in countless small ways each day. As we conclude this episode of Sleepless History, remember that history is not just about great leaders and dramatic events. It is about ordinary people living through extraordinary times, making difficult choices, and shaping the future through their actions. The people of Iran have shown remarkable courage and resilience over these 46 years. Their story continues, and its next chapter will be written by them. Thank you for listening. May you find rest in these histories and wake to a world of greater freedom and justice. Good night.